Emily Parker never expected that one ordinary afternoon would shatter her entire world, exposing her father Richard's forbidden secret with their neighbor and uncovering a darkness far more terrifying than an affair. Emily Parker was 16 when everything she believed about her family collapsed in one unforgettable afternoon. She had always seen her father, Richard, as the kind of man who could fix anything: broken lamps, fences, even bad days. He worked hard as an electrician, coming home every evening covered in the smell of metal and oil. Her mother, Lavra, was gentle and patient, working part-time at a local clinic and spending the rest of her hours tending to the house. Their life was simple, predictable, and safe. At least that was what Emily thought. Nothing about the Parkers ever seemed unusual until the day she came home from school early and saw something that made her body freeze and her heart hammer in confusion. It was late afternoon, and the sun was low enough to throw golden light across the backyard. Emily dropped her bag on the porch and went to grab the clothes from the line. As she moved toward the fence separating their yard from the neighbors, something caught her attention. Through the half-open curtains of Melissa Grant's house, she saw movement, a shadow first, then the unmistakable outline of her father. For a second, she thought he might have been fixing something. Melissa often called him to repair appliances. But the way his hands moved, the closeness between them, the intimacy of their actions, told a story that needed no words. It was her father and the neighbor. The shock hit her like a cold wave. She stood still, unable to look away even though she desperately wanted to. Her brain tried to find excuses. Maybe she had misread it. Maybe she was imagining things, but deep down she knew what she had seen. She turned and ran inside, her breath shaky, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold the doorknob. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Her mother came home humming, chatting about dinner, completely unaware. Richard returned later, smiling, tired, and acting as though everything was normal. Emily sat through dinner in silence, her appetite gone, her mind spinning with confusion and disgust. She barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the image replayed again and again, making her stomach twist. She wanted to scream, to tell someone, but she also feared what would happen if she did. Her mother loved her father deeply, and Emily knew this secret would destroy that love. The next morning, she forced herself through the routine school, homework, chores, but she avoided her father's eyes. She noticed every small thing about him now: the way he whistled while working, the fake cheer in his voice, the way he smelled faintly of another woman's perfume. Melissa lived alone, a single mother whose son had gone off to college. She was friendly, always waving from her porch, always wearing bright colors that made her stand out in their quiet neighborhood. Emily had never suspected anything strange about her. She had even liked her once. Now, every time she saw Melissa's car in the driveway, she felt a heavy mix of anger and sickness. Her father continued to visit her house occasionally, always under the excuse of fixing something, and her mother never questioned it. Weeks passed like this, the secret pressing heavier on Emily's chest until it became hard to breathe. Her grades began to slip, and she withdrew from her friends. At home, the tension between father and daughter grew silently. Richard noticed her distance, occasionally watching her with puzzled eyes, unaware that his daughter carried the weight of his betrayal. And strange things started happening. Late-night phone calls came to their home, but when her mother picked up, no one spoke. Sometimes Richard would leave the house after dinner, saying he had emergency repair work to do, returning hours later with the same faint perfume clinging to his shirt. Emily started noticing Melissa acting differently too. She looked nervous, distracted, and she avoided Emily's eyes whenever they met outside. Once, Melissa dropped a grocery bag as their eyes met, her face turning pale before she quickly walked away. Something about the way she looked scared made Emily's unease turn into dread. One rainy evening, Emily woke to the sound of her father's truck engine outside. She peered through the window and saw him pulling out of the driveway quietly, trying not to wake anyone. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The next morning, his boots were in the laundry room, covered with thick, wet mud. Her mother didn't ask questions, assuming he had been on a late job. Emily said nothing, but her thoughts spiraled. That same day, she noticed police cars parked outside Melissa's house. Officers were speaking to neighbors, and a small crowd had gathered. Her mother went out to ask what was happening and returned looking confused. Melissa's car had been found abandoned near a lake about 10 miles away. Her purse and phone were still inside. She hadn't been seen or heard from in 2 days. The police were treating it as a missing person case. Emily's stomach dropped. She sat on the couch in silence as her parents discussed it. Richard acted surprised, asking all the right questions, pretending concern. But Emily watched him closely and saw a flicker of something dark behind his eyes. It wasn't sadness or worry, it was fear. That night, as the rain tapped against her window, Emily lay in bed wide awake. The memory of what she had seen weeks ago now blended with the image of Melissa's empty house and her father's muddy boots. It felt like all the puzzle pieces were falling into place, creating a picture she didn't want to see. Her heart told her that Melissa's disappearance wasn't an accident, and somehow her father was connected. But she couldn't prove anything yet. She kept it buried deep inside, knowing that one wrong word could tear her family apart forever. Days turned into weeks, and the neighborhood grew quieter, more suspicious. People whispered about Melissa, about the kind of woman she was, about possible affairs and enemies. The police searched the woods near the lake but found nothing. Her mother baked pies for the officers to thank them, never realizing her husband might have been the last person to see Melissa alive. Emily wanted to scream the truth, but fear held her prisoner. The truth was like poison, slowly consuming her from the inside. Every time she looked at her father, she wondered how much darkness a person could hide behind a friendly smile. What she didn't know was that the truth she carried would soon become the key to uncovering something far worse than an affair. It would lead to a discovery that would destroy everything left of the Parker family. The disappearance of Melissa Grant consumed the small Ohio town in a storm of rumors and confusion. Everyone seemed to have a theory, but no one had any real answers. Some said she had left to start a new life somewhere far away. Others whispered that she had gotten involved with the wrong kind of man. But beneath all the gossip and speculation, Emily Parker knew there was a truth that no one else dared to speak. She had seen her father sneaking out of the house on the very night Melissa vanished, and the thought of it made her stomach twist with dread. The police visited the neighborhood again, knocking on every door, asking the same questions. When they reached the Parker house, Richard greeted them with his usual calm smile, his voice steady as he explained that he barely knew Melissa outside of helping her with electrical repairs. He said she was kind, a little lonely maybe, but harmless. The officers seemed satisfied and moved on, but Emily could feel her heart pounding as she watched them leave. She could see how easily her father could lie, how natural it was for him. After that, the atmosphere in the Parker house changed. The walls seemed quieter, heavier. Lavra spent her days baking and praying for Melissa's safe return, while Richard pretended to care, occasionally joining search parties or talking to the neighbors about how strange the whole thing was. But behind that mask of concern, Emily saw something else, a flicker of unease that grew stronger as the days passed. Sometimes she caught him standing at the window at night, staring toward the road that led to the lake. One afternoon, while her parents were out, Emily decided to go into the garage. It was something she had avoided before, but curiosity pushed her forward this time. She moved carefully, her hands trembling as she searched through the cluttered shelves. Her father's tools were neatly arranged, each one in its place, but in the corner sat a large black trash bag that didn't belong. When she opened it, she found clothes, his work shirt and pants, still faintly smelling of the same perfume she had noticed before. There were brown stains on the sleeves that looked like dried mud, but something about them made her feel sick. She quickly tied the bag again and shoved it back, her chest tightening with fear. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She told herself that maybe she was imagining things, that she was just paranoid because of what she had seen before. But the next day, the police returned with new information. Melissa's car had been towed in for inspection, and inside they found her phone and wallet. Nothing seemed stolen, but the battery in her phone was dead. When they accessed the call logs, they noticed one of the last numbers she had called was Richard Parker. Lavra didn't think much of it when the officers mentioned it, saying it made sense since he had fixed her wiring before. But Emily felt her blood run cold. She knew her father had been with Melissa that night. She could see the truth forming even if no one else could. The police asked Richard to come down to the station for questioning. He agreed without hesitation, even joking about how he hoped they would catch whoever was responsible. He left calmly, but when he came back, something about him had changed. His face looked pale, and his movements were sharper, more nervous. Days passed, and the tension inside the Parker home grew unbearable. Lavra tried to keep things normal, cooking big dinners and talking about family vacations they might take, but her voice sounded forced. Emily stayed in her room most of the time, trying to avoid both of her parents. One night she overheard them arguing in the kitchen. Her mother's tone was worried, her father's cold and defensive. She couldn't make out the words, but she could feel the anger pulsing through the walls. The next morning, Richard acted as though nothing had happened. He kissed his wife on the forehead, packed his lunch, and went to work. But Emily noticed something strange when she walked past his truck. There was a faint reddish stain on the back bumper, half hidden by dust. Her heart pounded as she brushed it with her fingers. It looked like rust, but when she smelled it, the metallic scent made her step back in horror. That evening, news broke that searchers had found a woman's shoe near the lake Melissa's size, the same brand she often wore. The police were expanding the search area, and once again, Richard volunteered to help. Emily watched from the porch as he grabbed his flashlight and gloves. The image of him walking into the darkness filled her with dread. When he returned later that night, she noticed the same muddy boots by the door again. He took a shower immediately, and Emily could hear the water running for a long time. After he went to bed, she crept down to the laundry room and looked at the boots more closely. The soles were caked with a fine layer of dried dirt mixed with something darker, something she didn't want to name. She touched it only for a second before pulling her hand away in disgust. The next day, 2 officers came back to their house, this time to ask more questions. Richard wasn't home, so they spoke to Lavra. They explained that some new evidence had surfaced, tire marks near where Melissa's car had been found. They matched a truck, possibly the same make and model as Richard's. Lavra brushed it off, insisting it must be a coincidence. But Emily knew there were no coincidences left in this story. That night she sat in her room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything she had seen, the affair, the perfume, the lies, the stains, the missing woman. The truth was circling closer, and she felt trapped in it. She wanted to go to the police, but fear stopped her every time. What if she was wrong? What if her father found out she had told someone? The thought of what he might do terrified her. A week later, the search near the lake intensified. Reporters started showing up, filming outside the neighborhood. The once quiet street was now filled with flashing lights and the hum of police radios. Richard tried to act normal, but Emily could see cracks forming in his calm exterior. He barely ate, he smoked constantly on the porch, and his hands trembled whenever the news mentioned Melissa's name. Then, one evening, the police announced that they had found something buried near the woods, a small piece of fabric and traces of blood. They wouldn't confirm anything yet, but everyone knew what it meant. Lavra broke down crying that night, clutching her chest, whispering prayers under her breath. Richard sat silently at the table, his eyes hollow. Emily could feel her heart racing as she realized the story was finally unraveling. But what she didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The truth about what happened to Melissa Grant would reach far deeper than she ever imagined. And the man sitting quietly across the table, pretending to be a worried husband and father, was about to become the center of one of the most chilling investigations their small town had ever seen. The police search near the lake continued for days, and each day brought more tension into the Parker household. The entire neighborhood was now caught in a mix of fear and fascination. Reporters stood outside with cameras, talking about how a quiet suburban community had become the center of a chilling mystery. Emily stayed hidden inside her room most of the time, watching from her window as officers combed through the woods. Every time she saw the flashes of their searchlights, she felt sick with dread. Somewhere deep down, she already knew what they would find. Her father tried to act normal, but the mask he wore was slipping. He woke earlier than usual, barely spoke to anyone, and kept leaving the house for hours without saying where he was going. When he came home, his eyes were bloodshot and his hands trembled as he poured himself a drink. Emily had never seen him so on edge. Her mother, Lavra, tried to convince herself that the investigation had nothing to do with them, but even she had started to notice Richard's strange behavior. His temper was short, and small arguments now turned into cold silences that lasted for days. One night, Emily woke up around midnight to a noise coming from below. The faint sound of something dragging echoed from the basement. She sat frozen for a few seconds, her heart thudding against her ribs, before forcing herself to get up. The house was dark, the only light coming from the hallway lamp. She crept down the stairs, careful not to make the floorboards creak. The basement door was slightly open, and through the crack she could see a faint glow from a flashlight. The sound stopped suddenly. She stood there, holding her breath, listening. Then she heard her father's footsteps coming up the stairs. She quickly ran back to her room, climbed into bed, and pulled the covers up just as the door down the hall opened. Richard walked past her room without a word. The next morning he acted as if nothing had happened. He ate breakfast, read the paper, and left for work. But Emily couldn't stop thinking about what she'd heard. That afternoon, when both her parents were gone, she went down to the basement. The air was thick and cold, and the smell of earth and metal hung heavy. The concrete floor was stained in places, and in one corner she saw a folded tarp. Something about it made her uneasy. When she pulled at it, she noticed faint, dark marked streaks that looked too much like dried blood. Her stomach turned as she dropped the fabric and backed away. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to tell someone, but who would believe her without proof? That evening, the news confirmed what everyone had feared. Human remains had been found in a shallow grave near the lake. The body was badly decomposed, but police were certain it belonged to a woman. They hadn't yet confirmed the identity, but everyone in town already knew it was Melissa. Lavra broke down crying when she heard. Richard just sat at the table, staring at nothing. Emily watched him closely, waiting for any sign of guilt or shock, but his face was blank, unreadable. 2 days later, police cars returned to their street. Officers went door to door again, collecting more statements. When they reached the Parker house, they asked to speak with Richard privately. Emily watched from the window as he stood outside, talking to them for nearly 20 minutes. When he came back inside, his hands were shaking slightly. He claimed it was just routine questioning, but Emily could tell he was rattled. Later that night, she overheard her parents talking in hushed voices. Her mother sounded worried, asking if there was something he wasn't telling her. Her father's voice was low, firm, almost cold. The argument ended with the sound of a door slamming. The next morning, Richard didn't show up for work. He told his wife he wasn't feeling well, but he spent most of the day sitting in the garage, staring at nothing. Emily walked past and saw him holding a small metal box, the kind people used to keep documents in. She didn't know what was inside, but he quickly shut it when he noticed her watching. That evening, the police called again. They asked Lavra to have Richard come down to the station once more. The remains had been officially identified as Melissa Grant. The cause of death was strangulation. Emily's chest tightened as the words sank in. She looked at her father, waiting for a reaction, but he simply nodded and said he would go. He showered, changed into clean clothes, and left without looking at anyone. Hours passed, and he still hadn't returned. Lavra grew increasingly anxious, pacing around the kitchen, calling his phone over and over. Emily sat on the couch, unable to speak. Then, close to midnight, headlights appeared outside. Richard came in, pale and quiet. He said the questioning had taken longer than expected, that the police were just being thorough. But Emily could tell something was wrong. He went straight to the basement again after that, locking the door behind him. The next morning, the police were back, this time with a warrant. They searched the house, starting with the basement. Lavra protested, confused and terrified, but the officers were firm. Emily stood near the stairs, her heart pounding as they carried out boxes, bags, and the tarp she had seen. One of the officers held up the tarp carefully, his face grim. That was when she knew they had found something. Richard was taken away in handcuffs as neighbors gathered outside, whispering and pointing. Lavra screamed that it had to be a mistake, that her husband was a good man, but Emily didn't move. She just stood there, watching as the man she thought she knew was placed in the back of a police car. Her mind was spinning, but deep inside, a part of her wasn't surprised. She had known the truth long before anyone else did. In the days that followed, everything became a blur. Reporters surrounded their home, and Lavra refused to leave her bedroom. Emily barely spoke to anyone. She kept remembering the moment she had seen through that window, how that single glimpse had started everything. She replayed the image of her father with the neighbor, the late-night trips, the tarp, the smell in the basement. Every piece fit together now. When she finally gathered the courage to go down to the basement one last time, she found the place nearly empty. The police had taken most of the evidence, but the smell still lingered. In the corner where the tarp had been, she noticed a faint outline on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged there. She stared at it for a long time, feeling cold from the inside out. That night, as she lay in bed, Emily realized her life would never go back to the way it was. The quiet home she grew up in had become the scene of something unspeakable. The man she once saw as her protector had turned into a stranger. And even though the police had taken him away, the darkness he left behind stayed within those walls. Every creak, every whisper of the house felt haunted by secrets she could never unsee. The town was shaken by the arrest of Richard Parker. The story spread faster than wildfire, filling newspapers, news broadcasts, and every conversation in the neighborhood. The image of the quiet electrician who had lived among them for years turned into that of a suspected killer. Reporters called him the neighbor's lover-murderer, and though the trial hadn't even started, most people had already made up their minds. The once friendly greetings that Emily and her mother used to receive turned into stares and whispers. The Parker house, once a symbol of comfort, became a place of silence and fear. Lavra could not believe what was happening. She insisted that her husband was innocent, that the police had made a terrible mistake. She spent her days calling lawyers, collecting documents, and writing letters to anyone who would listen. But every piece of evidence that surfaced made it harder to defend him. The tarp from the basement had traces of Melissa Grant's DNA. Fibers from her clothing were found on Richard's boots. The phone records proved he was in contact with her on the night she disappeared. Everything pointed in one direction. Emily stayed quiet through it all. She didn't attend school anymore. Reporters had followed her once, asking for comments, and she had run back inside crying. She spent most of her days in her room, trying to drown out the sound of her mother sobbing in the kitchen. At night, when the world outside grew still, she could hear the faint echo of police sirens in her dreams. The house felt empty now, even though her mother was still there. The absence of her father had left a strange hollowness in every room. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was filled with people eager to see what would happen. Richard sat there in a gray suit, his face expressionless. He didn't look like the man who used to laugh at the dinner table or fix broken light switches for neighbors. He looked older, colder, almost as if something inside him had already died. The prosecution laid out the evidence piece by piece: his affair with Melissa, his presence near the lake, the DNA found in his basement. They painted a picture of a man who had fallen into obsession and then acted out of rage when Melissa tried to end things. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial. They said there was no direct proof he had killed her, no witness who saw it happen. But their arguments sounded weaker with every passing day. Then, the day came when the prosecution called their most unexpected witness, Emily. When she was led to the stand, the room went silent. Her mother's eyes were red from crying, and her father looked at her with a cold, pleading expression that made her stomach twist. She could barely meet his gaze. Her hands trembled as she spoke, her voice small at first, but growing steadier as she described what she had seen. She told the court about that afternoon when she came home early and saw her father with Melissa through the neighbor's window. She explained how he had acted in the days after, how he disappeared late at night, how she found the tarp and the muddy boots. The courtroom hung on every word. Her mother cried silently as Emily spoke. Her father stared at her without blinking. When she finished, there was a heavy silence that lasted for several seconds before the judge called for a break. That moment changed everything. From that point on, there was no going back. After her testimony, Emily avoided the courtroom. She stayed home during most of the trial, unable to face her father again. Each day she waited for updates from the news, listening to the reporters talk about evidence and witness statements. It was strange hearing strangers discuss her life, her home, and her family's downfall. Every word cut deeper. When the verdict finally came, it was no surprise to anyone. Richard Parker was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lavra collapsed in tears when she heard the words. Emily just sat there, numb. The man who had raised her, who had taught her how to ride a bike and told her stories before bed, was gone forever. But in truth, she had lost him long before that day. The days after the sentencing were some of the darkest in Emily's life. Reporters still called, asking for interviews, but she refused to speak. Her mother's health began to decline from stress and heartbreak. She stopped eating properly, rarely left her room, and sometimes talked as if her husband were still at home. Emily took care of her as best she could, but she too was falling apart inside. The nightmares grew worse. She kept seeing her father's eyes staring at her from the witness stand, full of something she couldn't name: anger, regret, or maybe both. Eventually, the town moved on. People stopped talking about the case as new scandals replaced it. The Parker house remained standing, but it was now avoided by most neighbors. Some swore it was haunted, others just pitied the broken family inside. Emily finished school through online classes and began working part-time to support her mother. Life became a quiet routine again, but the silence carried a different weight now. It wasn't peace, it was grief settled deep into the walls. One evening, months after the verdict, a letter arrived. The envelope was thick, with a prison return address stamped on it. Emily froze when she saw the name. It was from her father. She thought about throwing it away, but something stopped her. She sat at the kitchen table and opened it with shaking hands. The letter was written neatly, each word pressed into the paper as if done with care. He said he was sorry for everything. He admitted to the affair but insisted he hadn't killed Melissa. He claimed she had threatened to expose their relationship and someone else had intervened. He wrote that there were things she didn't know, things the police never found. Near the end of the letter, he wrote a sentence that made her blood run cold. "I wasn't the only one there that night." Emily read the letter over and over, her hands trembling more each time. The words echoed in her mind. If he was telling the truth, then someone else out there was responsible or had helped him. She didn't know which was worse. When her mother found her sitting at the table, pale and silent, Emily simply folded the letter and said nothing. There was no strength left in her to face another storm. That night, she placed the letter in a drawer and locked it away. She told herself she would never open it again, but deep inside, she knew it wasn't over. The story that had torn her family apart might not have ended in the courtroom. Somewhere out there, a missing piece of the truth still waited, buried beneath lies and silence. And Emily, no matter how much she wanted to forget, could never escape the shadow her father had left behind. Weeks passed, and Emily tried to pretend that life was returning to normal, but nothing truly felt normal anymore. Every corner of the house reminded her of what had happened. The basement, once her father's workspace, now stayed locked. The kitchen, where laughter once filled the air, was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Her mother rarely spoke and spent most of her days staring out the window as if expecting someone to return. Emily avoided the letter in the drawer, but her thoughts always wandered back to it. The words burned inside her memory. Her father's claim that he wasn't the only one there that night. At first, she told herself it was just another lie, a desperate attempt to manipulate her emotions. But then little details started to resurface in her mind, details she hadn't thought mattered before. She remembered seeing a car parked near the lake the night Melissa disappeared. Not her father's, but a different one, a dark sedan that looked oddly familiar. She had dismissed it back then, thinking it belonged to someone fishing nearby. Now she wasn't so sure. Curiosity turned into obsession. Emily started looking through her father's old things, searching for any clue that might explain what he meant. She found old receipts, tool invoices, and photographs, but nothing unusual. One night, she discovered a small flash drive hidden inside a hollowed-out book in his study. She plugged it into her laptop, expecting maybe financial documents or work files. Instead, it contained photos, dozens of them. Most were of electrical projects, but mixed in between were pictures of Melissa Grant. Some were candid, taken from a distance, while others appeared more personal, showing her smiling, unaware of the camera. The final folder was password protected. Emily stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She tried a few simple combinations, her father's birthday, their address, her name. Nothing worked. Then she remembered something, an old habit of his. Whenever he set passwords for family devices, he used the date of something meaningful. She typed in 0716, the date of Melissa's disappearance. The folder opened. Inside were 3 short videos. The first was a recording from her father's phone, showing him and Melissa together in her living room. It confirmed the affair beyond any doubt. The second was darker, grainy footage from what seemed like a hidden camera in Melissa's backyard. It showed her arguing with someone, but the other person was off-screen. Emily replayed the video several times, straining to make out a shape or voice, but the shadows concealed everything. Then she clicked the third video. It was filmed near the lake where Melissa's body had been found. The camera was shaky, as if recorded secretly from behind bush. The footage showed 2 figures. One was clearly her father, but the other was shorter, wearing a dark hood. They were dragging something that looked like a tarp. Emily froze. The video ended abruptly after 30 seconds. Her pulse raced as she stared at the screen. There was no sound, no timestamp, nothing to indicate who had taken the video or when. But the presence of that second person changed everything. The next morning, Emily decided to take the flash drive to the police. But when she reached the local station, she hesitated. The case was officially closed. Her father had already been convicted, and the evidence she carried could reopen everything. That meant more reporters, more public humiliation, and possibly more pain for her mother, who had barely recovered from the trial. Emily turned around and walked back home, clutching the flash drive tightly in her hand. That night she couldn't sleep. The images haunted her. She began to wonder if her father had been telling the truth all along. What if someone else had been involved, someone from the neighborhood? She thought about the people who had been close to her family, the ones who had helped her father during his work projects. One name kept resurfacing in her mind. Tom Wilkins, their next-door neighbor and Melissa's husband. Tom had moved away a month after the trial, selling his house at a low price and leaving town quietly. At the time, everyone assumed he couldn't bear to live near the scene of his wife's scandal and death. But now that seemed too convenient. Emily started digging through old emails and text messages. She found one from Tom to her father dated a week before Melissa's disappearance. It was short. "We need to talk tonight." Her stomach dropped. The message had never been mentioned during the trial. Either the police had overlooked it, or her father had hidden it. She checked the timestamp. It was sent just hours before Melissa went missing. Suddenly, the image from the video made sense. The second figure could have been Tom. The next day, Emily drove to the neighboring town where she heard Tom had moved. She parked outside a small, weathered house with a for sale sign in front. The yard was unkempt, and the windows were covered with blinds. She sat there for nearly an hour watching. When a man finally came out to check the mailbox, she felt her heart jump. It was him. Older, thinner, but unmistakably Tom Wilkins. He glanced around nervously as if expecting to be watched. Emily didn't approach him. She drove away, shaking, her mind spinning with questions. If he was truly involved, what had happened that night? Had they both confronted Melissa? Had something gone wrong? Or had he framed her father after things spiraled out of control? That evening, Emily made one final decision. She copied the videos from the flash, drive onto a new one, and mailed it anonymously to the district attorney's office with a note that simply read, "There's more you need to see." She didn't include her name or address. Then she destroyed the original drive. Weeks went by without a response. Then, one afternoon, she saw a headline online, "New evidence surfaces in Parker case authorities reopen investigation." Her hands trembled as she read further. The article said the footage suggested a possible accomplice. Police were reportedly investigating a former neighbor who had left town shortly after the murder. No names were given, but she knew who they meant. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt a strange sense of relief, not happiness, but something closer to peace. The truth was finally starting to surface. Her father might still be guilty of terrible things, but maybe he hadn't acted alone. Maybe, at last, the full story would be known. That night she sat by the window, watching the rain fall softly against the glass. Her mother had gone to bed early, leaving the house quiet again. Emily thought about everything that had happened, the secret she uncovered, the pain it had caused, and the uncertainty that still remained. She knew this wasn't truly the end. Some truths would take years to unravel, some wounds might never heal. But deep down, she also knew she had done the right thing. She had faced the darkness her father left behind and refused to let it consume her. The secrets buried in the shadows had finally begun to see the light. And though the past could never be erased, Emily was determined that it would no longer define her future.